Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the introduction to psycholinguistics, or to the idea of psychology of language. And what is this idea of psychology of language, or what do we mean by this aspect of psycholinguistics? So today is really kind of the introduction to the course, aside from just your regular discussion of the syllabus that you all should have completed last week. But today we really want to talk about this aspect of what is psycholinguistics. Just before we begin, just a couple of quick reminders. Number one, your language journal, number one, is due by Friday by 11:59 p.m. Make sure to submit that by 11:59 p.m. On Blackboard. I've created a link under Week 2 module where you can click on journal entry number 1, and they'll automatically prompt you to be able to create your journal entry, so you can be able to type in there. Again, remember that the parameters associated with what's appropriate for your journal entries is stated clearly on the syllabus, so I would recommend going back to the syllabus if you do have any questions in regards to the journal entries, or what is appropriate for our journal entry. So please make sure to complete that. Aside from that, please just follow along with the information associated with Week 2 that I've also posted under the Week 2 folder, and go ahead and complete that. So let's go ahead and begin in talking a little bit about the history of psycholinguistics. So when we actually think about psychology of language, or this aspect of psycholinguistics, where is it that that spoken language kind of originated from? So where is the first reports that we ever have of spoken languages actually being reported? Well, to be honest with you, spoken language origin is actually quite obscured. We're not really sure when it is that spoken languages really came into effect. But we do know, for instance, when written languages kind of came into effect. The very first instances of written language were somewhere around 5000 BC. We've actually found some reports of written languages being provided earlier than that, but somewhere around 5000 BC is when it is that we've kind of identified systematically when the first written languages were kind of produced. In terms of what those written languages consisted of or constituted of, it really kind of depends. A lot of it is more graphical representations or symbols, not necessarily alphabets that we're talking about in this particular instance. Those came more formalized later on, but in reality here, the very first languages that we actually ever had were more of symbols than anything else. So currently we have somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 languages. It's quite a funny thing to think about the number of languages, because when you actually think about that, most of the time we're like, oh, you think of the main ones. You think of Spanish, English, French, German, Portuguese, Russian, and so on and so forth. But then you start kind of running thin in terms of what other languages are available. So it's not really until you begin to think that there's so many other dialects, so many other languages that are formalized that do exist in terms of our world, that you really begin to think of the magnitude and how many languages it is that are actually readily available for us to actually learn. So think about that, right, with Rosetta Stone, that Rosetta Stone only really has a couple of languages that you can really learn, but there are thousands upon thousands of languages that actually exist. Now, the unfortunate aspect associated with the number of these languages is that more and more of these languages are actually dying out. So, in other words, we are having less and less languages actually being available to us to learn, because of the issue of individuals no longer finding the utility of those particular languages. So, you may have an obscure language that is spoken only in Indonesia. Well, a group of people may actually use that language, but that's not something that's usable for us, or something that's really applicable for us to actually learn in our current society. So less and less people start using that language as generations continue to go through. They also start using that language less, thus leading to those languages potentially dying out. Now, I guess one of the major issues that a lot of individuals really are kind of concerned with, and as psycholinguistic researchers, we really had these questions also initially. So what was really the first language? What was the true primitive language that we all kind of knew? Or what is this language that was the very first one that we all kind of stem from? That is a very complex question that we have in terms of trying to find the first true primitive language. we really don't have specific reports, and again, it goes back to this aspect of spoken languages, or the origin of spoken languages being very obscured, that we don't really know what is the true primitive language. And there are reports of different languages being the true primitive language. To be honest, none of them are really that accurate. Now, when we also think about the ancient thinking associated with language, we can start off by thinking of this aspect of the Tower of Babel. So just very briefly here, I do want to show you the Bible verses associated with the idea of the Tower of Babel. So I'm going to read these very quickly here to you. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make brick and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them all over the face of the whole earth. So ultimately, what is the idea of the story of the Tower of Babel? Well, essentially here, the Babylonians were creating this tower, so essentially they could be able to reach the heavens, so that way they could reach as high as possible and be able to be next to God, if you really want to think about that. So since they all spoke one single language, it was then told that God would come down, or the Lord came down, and confused everybody with different speech, so thus leading them to spread all over the world and kind of have these segregated areas around the world where specific languages were essentially being spoken, or variations of what we currently now have as our current languages are being spoken. So when we think about this aspect of the Tower of Babel, it's a great start for us to think in terms of biblical terms that this is a very good report for us. It's a very old report, or a very historical report as to how languages were kind of created in this particular instance, or how it is that we came to have so many different languages occur in our world. Now, there are also other ideas associated with the way that we think of the ancestry of language. A very ancient pharaoh by the name of Psammiticus was very interested in this aspect of, well, what was the very first true primitive language in the world? And according to Psammiticus, what he wanted to do is he wanted to try to identify, well, what is that ancient race? So if he could identify the ancient language, or the very first language that an individual would be born with, thus then that would indicate for us what the ancient race would also be. So what Psammiticus did is he has an individual in his council by the name of Herodotus, and Herodotus's job is ultimately to try to understand or identify what is the most ancient race. So how is it that Herodotus is going to do this? Well, essentially he's going to take two peasant children and he's going to isolate them at birth. So when you think about this ethically, right? So if you guys think back to general psychology class, and we think back to like the little Albert case, right, with John Watson and the things that he did with little Albert, that he would just bang this metal bar with a hammer behind him and he would scare him, and we thought that was highly unethical. Imagine this, right? The Herodotus taking two peasant children, so he's taking them away from their mothers and from their father, and he's isolating them, these children at birth, so completely keeping them segregated from their families and trying to have absolutely nobody talk to these individuals for about 2 years. So there's no linguistic input given to them for 2 years. So what does Herodotus find? He finds that one of the first children that actually speaks or produces an utterance is the word bekos. And the word bekos was Phrygian for the word bread. So thus, Herodotus concluded for Psammiticus that the Phrygian, Psammiticus' race, was essentially the oldest race. Now, if you think about this in terms of potential factors that may have contributed to a child saying the word bekos, there's a couple of things here. So number one, think about this, right? So Psammiticus and Herodotus probably speak Phrygian, right? Because they're the ones doing the research study. So what language input is around these children, even though maybe nobody is providing them with specific or direct linguistic input, so no one is speaking directly to these children. Well, they're probably still speaking Frisian around, outside of wherever it is that these children are being, wherever these children are being kept. So you can think about that, right? So Frisian is being spoken around these kids, even though maybe not directly. So now let's say, for instance, you have to keep these children alive for 2 years. So how are you going to keep children alive for 2 years? Probably at the initial stages that you're going to try to keep them alive, you're probably going to give them a lot of milk, right? So especially, and we're going to see this throughout the development of language later on when we talk about language development, that at the initial points when a child is born, right, they have no ability to actually produce specific words like I'm currently producing. If anything, right around about 9, 10 months of age, they really begin to babble. So going back to the Tower of Babel, that's where we get the term babble from. So they begin to babble a lot, probably around age 12 months to a year. They may actually begin to produce specific types of utterances that may sound like words. So they may begin to say the things like mama, papa, dada, mom, or whatever the case may be. Very, very specific terms, and we'll talk about why not other terms are actually produced later on in terms of production ability. But right around 1 year of age, the food content that you have to give a child really doesn't always have to now be just milk. It can potentially then become water, and it can also be bread, or bread and milk if you want, right? So bread is going to be a primary component that you're probably going to give these children. And again, remember, they're peasant children, so they're probably not going to be feeding them, these steaks or rotisserie chickens or whatever it is that you want that are going to be for the higher class people. They're probably going to be giving them the basic aspects, which are probably going to be milk or water and bread. So it's feasible for us to think that the people who are bringing these children bread, so as they're getting older, they're probably giving them the bread, and at some point in time, they're probably saying the term becos in front of these children. So even though they think, oh, well, these children, they probably don't even understand anything, even if we talk around them because no one's ever talked around them, well, we're just going to use this term, they can make an association. So if, for instance, one of the servants brings in the bread and he turns to one of the other servants that says, oh, becos, reference to the bread, and then gives the bread to the child, who's now going to be around 2 years of age, potentially the child may make the association of becos meaning bread, or may just produce becos because he's been hearing those utterances being made around them. So here, when you think about that aspect of, is that really the true primitive language? Probably not. What was probably happening with these children is they were learning just as they would normally learn. They were making associations, and they were repeating things that they actually heard out in their environment. So here, Herodotus and Psammiticus, unfortunately, were wrong in terms of thinking that the most ancient race was Phrygian, just because the first utterances that were made was in reference to the Phrygian language in terms of it being the term bekos. So in reality, it's just a natural part of them evolving and learning language as they're supposed to be learning it. But still a very interesting kind of first attempt at trying to understand what was the very first language ever spoken. We also start now looking at more experimental research studies in terms of language and thought processes. William Wundt, who you all should be somewhat familiar with from general psychology, he was the very first individual to ever establish a true experimental psychological laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Leipzig, Germany, back in 1879. He is essentially, for us, the founder of experimental psychology, so we all trace our lineage back to William Wundt. So he actually started trying to explore some of the relationships between human mind and language, and trying to understand how it is that we actually produce language and what it is that we actually use to interpret some information associated with language. So he was one of the very first true psychologists to ever really discuss the importance of language as a psychological phenomenon. So he actually divided language up into two very specific aspects. The two aspects that he essentially discussed were what he called the outer phenomena, which are the actual produced or perceived utterances. So if we think about sentences as being units, so for instance, what I'm currently producing, that is your outer phenomenon. So the actual way that I'm producing the sounds to actually create words, and then those words are then going to be used to create sentences, etc., 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 right? And then he also had what was called the inner phenomenon, which is the cognitive process associated with the utterances, so the aspect of comprehension. So if you want to think of outer phenomena as being just production and inner phenomenon being now the comprehension aspect. So also think of it in this particular way. Let's say, for instance, that you don't know what a term means, right? Or somebody gave you the wrong term when you were growing up. So let's use two examples here. So the first example will be a term that you're probably not very familiar with. The term that we're going to discuss here is what's called defenestrate. So if you had to think about what the term defenestrate means, think about that to yourself. What does that really mean? Without looking it up, right? So don't Google it. So defenestrate. Well, defenestrate really means, and this is the actual the actual definition of defenestrate, it means to kick somebody out of a window. So that may not be a term that you were really familiar with, and now that you're thinking of it, you're like, wow, we actually had a term for the act of kicking somebody out of a window? And the answer is yes, it's defenestrate. So you've defenestrated somebody, right? So you've kicked somebody out of a window, or you're going to defenestrate somebody. So in other words, you're going to kick somebody out of a window. So ultimately, this is a new term that we've created, right? So let's say, for instance, I didn't actually ever tell you that the term defenestrate means to kick somebody out of a window, but yet I told you that the term defenestrate means to write on a board. If that's what you actually believed growing up, that the term defenestrate means to write on the board, and now later on somebody were to tell you, hey, I'm going to defenestrate you, you'd be like, well, that's weird. How are they going to write me on the board? Like, I don't understand how that fits. So ultimately here, what William Wundt was saying, well, look, somebody's producing something. So in other words, the outer phenomenon, right? They're creating the sentence. So I'm going to defenestrate you. That person means they're going to try to kick you out of a window. For you, though, you're like, well, that's weird because my understanding of what defenestrate means is that it's to write on the board. So how are you going to write on a board with me? I don't really understand that. So it doesn't make sense. So according to William Wundt, there's this differentiation between the outer and the inner phenomenon. The outer phenomenon corresponding to this aspect of, well, it's only what I'm actually producing in terms of words. Those words together then produce sentences. Now here I'm not talking about comprehension at all, but now I look at the inner phenomenon, the way I understand what it is that you're actually giving me, and it's the way that I'm actually processing that information and thus leading me to comprehending what is being discussed. So according to Wundt, language really begins with this idea of trying first to transmit an idea or a purpose. And when you actually think about all language corresponds to this beginning. So in other words, there is no reason for us to produce language unless we're trying to transmit an idea or we're trying to transmit a purpose to another individual. So even think about infants. Infants, for instance, when they begin to babble, they're beginning to babble not just because of mimicry, but they're also beginning to babble because they're trying to transmit a message. To the best of their abilities, they're using what they're learning as a means of communication, so it may not necessarily be effective, but you'll normally see parents doing this kind of thing, that the child will babble and the parent will say something to the degree of, oh, what do you want? Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? So for instance, I have a daughter who's just about a year old, and she's got a couple of words. She's got mama, she's got papa, and she goes, that's what she does. And essentially what my daughter will do, she will point in a specific direction, and she'll go, and we always say, ¿A dónde quieres ir? Where do you want to go? She'll go, and she'll point in that direction. So for her, she's now understanding, well, if I want to go in that specific direction, I'm going to produce this sound. For us, is completely meaningless because it doesn't actually have any referent that it actually pertains to, right? So it doesn't actually mean anything for us, but we're trying to understand what she's actually producing. So thus, you ask specific questions that correspond to that specific utterance, so that production. So thus, you can move in that specific direction, or you can actually have an action that corresponds to that specific idea. And that's a very, very important thing for us. Now, part of the history of psychology, and this is actually part of the article that I've uploaded for you all that I would really like for everyone to read. So make sure that you do read that article that I've provided for you, the one that was called Behaviorism and Psycholinguistics. It's a very, very important article for you to read. It kind of really talks about the history of psychology of language for us within the field of psychology. Now, prior to the 1950s, in psychology, we really didn't have an official psycholinguistic movement. We didn't really have a psychology of language branch or anything like that. In psychology here in the United States, we had the idea of behaviorism. You all should be vaguely familiar with this idea of behaviorism. Very big proponents of behaviorism, Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson. You also had B.F. Skinner, which were the three main individuals associated with behaviorism. If you remember with Ivan Pavlov and his very famous classical conditioning studies with his dog, right, that he would make the dog salivate. with John B. Watson, the little Albert studies of trying to condition fear in the individual, so the emotional aspects of conditioning. And then you also look at B.F. Skinner in terms of actual shaping or the training of operant conditioning for pigeons and for other animals and also for humans, in terms of them reacting in a very specific way. So the idea of behaviorism, just to kind of give you an overview of this, and if you ever take a history of psychology class, which I strongly recommend, you'll get much more of an understanding of this aspect of behaviorism. Behaviorists believed in a very rigorous empiricism movement. So prior to behaviorism, we had these ideas given to us by William Wundt. So the ideas of William Wundt, so kind of going back to this, you have this aspect of the outer phenomenon and the aspect of the inner phenomenon. When you think of this aspect of the inner phenomenon, what is it that he meant with inner phenomenon? Inner phenomenon essentially meant the following for us. I have to comprehend, but I have to tell you what I think it means. So in other words, we have to have this idea of introspection, right? So you all should have learned this aspect of, or this idea of introspection. So this idea of looking within. So if I ask you a question, how do you feel today? And you answer me, you're looking within yourself, the idea of introspection, and now reporting that. Now, when you think of that aspect of introspection, introspection in itself is quite limited, right? Or there's a lot of limitations associated with introspection. Why? Because I may ask you, how are you feeling? And you're feeling terrible, but you don't want to tell me you feel terrible. So you say, well, I feel great, I feel fine, stop bothering me. So now all of a sudden, I have to take it for your word, and I say, well, she feels fine because that's what she said to me, not that she feels terrible. So according to behaviorists, that process of using introspection was quite limited, and it was quite problematic for us. And why is it problematic and limited? Well, because we may not actually be getting natural responses. So rather, we want to actually have a rigorous empirical view of the world and only observe behaviors of specific interest that I am in control of and that I can see them produce. I'm not going to be taking an individual's word for validity in terms of the aspect of a production of a behavior. I actually have to see them produce an overt behavior for me to be able to then believe them that this is going to be adequate. So, since they believe this idea of a very rigorous empiricism movement, they also have this very general belief of what we call the tabula rasa, or the blank slate. You all may be familiar with this idea. So, the idea of the tabula rasa, or the blank slate, was essentially that we're born with this tablet that is completely blank. Think of a computer, for instance. It's a computer that has no programs on it. It becomes completely blank. So the only thing that it actually has the hard drive and it has the operating system. And that's it. But it comes with no programs at all. So since it doesn't come with anything written on the tablet itself or on this blank piece of paper, if you want to think of it like that, well, essentially what we now have to do is we now have to write on that specific tablet. So B.F. Skinner, who was a huge proponent of this idea of behaviorism and of the tabula rasa, and he's been doing lots and lots of work throughout his life, essentially showing that we can actually condition people to behave in specific fashions. So one of the ideas of behaviorism was, if I have a stimulus that I produce for you, you should then have a response. So what he tries to do at this point in time, so essentially what he wants to do at this point in time is he wants to show how individuals produce language in the exact same way. So in other words, I have a stimulus, the individual will respond in this specific fashion because that's the way we've trained them to respond. Not that we have the free will to respond in any capacity that we want, but that I'm going to respond in that capacity because I've been conditioned or I've been trained to respond in that specific fashion. So in 1957, B.F. Skinner writes what we now call verbal behavior. So it's a very famous book that B.F. Skinner writes, essentially where he tries to attempt to apply operant techniques to language. So in other words, he tries to show how a stimulus ultimately can control language. So in other words, I produce a stimulus, you will produce this specific response for me in terms of language. So in other words, all verbal behavior, in other words, speech production, is learned and created from this idea of a stimulus and response. Now, very importantly, what does B.F. Skinner actually believe in? He believes the following. Every single utterance that we are currently producing has already been spoken in the past by somebody else. We repeated it, they reinforced us, now we're using it in the future because we've learned it in that specific capacity. So again, just to reiterate, what does B.F. Skinner believe in? He says all things that we are currently saying or that we will say in the future are things that we have learned because somebody else has produced them. They've reinforced us, so we now produce them, right? So somebody else has said it, we now say it, they reinforce us and they say, good job, right? So now we are much more likely to then use it in the future whenever a specific stimulus comes up. So the same topic comes up in conversation, we are much more likely to produce that exact same sentence because we've been reinforced in the past because of it. Now, this is a very, very kind of slippery slope and a dangerous idea to kind of think about because we, for instance, in cognitive psychology, aren't firm believers of that idea, and I'll talk about that differentiation in just a bit here. So according to B.F. Skinner, there are going to be similar results that are going to be shown by humans and non-human species in terms of stimulus and responses. So just the way that rats or pigeons responded to a specific stimulus in their specific environments, humans are going to respond the exact same way, but now in terms of language. Now, in 1957, a renowned linguist by the name of Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky is actually still alive. Noam Chomsky, in his current work, he writes a lot of political pieces and talks about inequality in the world. But at his initial points in his career, he was a linguist, and he gets a hold of B.F. Skinner's verbal response book, or his article, Verbal Behavior. So Noam Chomsky now decides to write an article that kind of refutes the idea of this aspect of verbal behavior, that language is only produced because of a stimulus and a response. So the critique that Noam Chomsky makes of B.F. Skinner in 1959 is essentially the following. Sentences are not linear strings of words. So in other words, we have discontinuous constituents. So what does this mean for us? It means that we can actually change language around, or we can change sentences around, and thus still make sense. So we don't always have to use the exact same sentence structure to convey the exact same meaning. So that kind of refutes already the idea of verbal behavior, because according to verbal behavior in B.F. Skinner, I'm going to produce a sentence because I want to transmit this specific message. It's going to get reinforced because a person then will respond in that specific fashion, thus reinforcing my sentence and me thus using it in the future. So I'm going to continue to use the exact same sentence. So then why would we have this necessity then, or this ability to be able then to change sentences around and still make the exact same response? So for instance, think of the following. If we have certain phrasal verbs such as switch the light on, that ultimately is transmitting a very specific message. So in other words, we're going to turn on the light, right? So turn on the light versus switch the light on still conveys the exact same meaning in both instances. Now here, very important also, you'll notice that we have multiple verbs, switch and on. That's not always a requirement. So not all sentences contain multiple verbs. That's not a requirement. In this specific instance, we did. We could have said turn the light on, still two verbs, or the light on, right? You could have said the light on to an individual, and the individual may have responded with that. So here we have one single verb, and that still transmits the exact same message. Now, we also have word segments that are separated by explicitive insertions, such as absolutely, for instance, and we still transmit the exact same message. So here, I have creativity. I have the ability to create new words using old words and still have the same meaning being transmitted, or even a different meaning if I wanted to have a different meaning. So if you say absolutely versus absolutely, now you transmitted a little bit of a different message by inserting that blooming into the word in that particular case. Now, Noam Chomsky also produces the following critique for us, that we cannot account for the creativity of language, that we as humans have this wonderful ability to be able to create language as much as we want and in the way that we want it to be produced, which is a great thing for us to be able to do. So according to Noam Chomsky, we speak strings of words that have never been produced before or have never been heard. So in other words, we have what's called the poverty of stimulus argument. What does the poverty of stimulus argument mean? It means that I can use a very limited amount of data given to an individual or given to a child, for instance, but language continues to develop. So in other words, I don't have to teach children, for instance, every single word that exists in the dictionary and show them every single use, but yet children can still produce very creative sentences. So how does that work? So B.F. Skinner would tell us, well, that's impossible. The child will only use the words that you've given them in that specific order because that's what they've heard, they've used it in the past, and they've now produced it. That's the only reason. So ultimately, what does this mean for us? It essentially means that Noam Chomsky was saying the following. Look, I can teach children specific words, but once I teach them those specific words, they have the ability, the innate ability, to be able to create and be creative in their mechanisms to be able to use language. So think of a child, think of a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. When have you sat down with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and gone through the entire dictionary and taught them every single word that exists in the language? Probably never, right? And you're never going to do that. I have a 3-year-old and I've never done that and I do not plan to do it. But then how is my child so creative in terms of her production? Because sometimes my child says very interesting things and I'm like, I don't even understand how it is that she actually learned that information. Well, how does that necessarily work for us then? Well, it ultimately means that in specific instances, children allow their minds to work so creatively and use terms in the appropriate fashion and create new sentences that have never been produced by anyone else or even by someone in their presence. And ultimately, that's what Noam Chomsky is trying to get at, that we have this great ability to be able to create language all on our own, that I don't have to always find these formal ways of learning information and producing only that. I can use creativity to be able to produce that. Now, he also very famously gave the following sentence: colorless green ideas sleep furiously versus furious sleep ideas green colorless. Now, ultimately, what was Chomsky trying to do here? He was trying to refute the idea that we only speak sentences that have been produced by others. So according to Noam Chomsky, I'm producing the sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And what he was trying to transmit to B.F. Skinner, right, transmit in a quote-unquote way, right? And it's kind of a pun here. He was trying to transmit a sentence that was grammatically correct, doesn't violate the rules of grammar for English, but has absolutely no meaning at all, versus the sentence, furiously sleep ideas green colorless. So if you read both of those sentences, colorless green ideas sleep furiously versus furiously sleep ideas green colorless, it's actually harder to say the second sentence versus the first one. And the reason it's harder to say the second sentence versus the first sentence is because the second sentence is grammatically incorrect. The first sentence is actually correct. It follows our rules of grammar. So it actually has a noun, a subject, and a verb. It follows our rules of grammar. The second one also has them, but it has them in the wrong order, thus making it much more difficult for us to actually have that sentence being produced. So in our own mechanism that we have built within ourselves that we've been using to learn language and the grammatical rules that we have associated with our language, it's actually stopping us from trying to produce sentence number 2 and making it harder because it's trying to fit in those rules of grammar that we've learned and that we just become to know in our own language that I don't know explicitly, and I'll talk about those a little bit later on. But ultimately here, I'm able to still produce it, but it's much more difficult for me to produce sentence number 2 because it's not correct. Sentence number 1, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, is grammatically correct, but it doesn't have any meaning. So what does it mean, colorless green ideas sleep furiously? So how do you have something that is green but that is colorless at the same time? How are ideas green? So what does that mean, a green idea, or a colorless green idea for that fact? How do ideas sleep? And aside from that, how do you sleep furiously? Do you sleep furiously like shaking your hands at night? I don't understand how that actually what that means. And that was exactly Noam Chomsky's point. It doesn't have any meaning, but it's grammatically correct. So how is it possible that I've created a grammatically correct sentence that doesn't have any meaning? Going back to what Wundt told us, all sentences that we produce or all linguistic communications that we have, let that be verbal and or writing, has to have a meaning behind it. But now we're refuting that statement by saying, well, B.F. Skinner is saying that the only reason that you produce this language is because you have a stimulus that corresponds to it, and because somebody's reinforced it in the past, because when you've actually produced it, now somebody else said, good job, that's exactly what you should have done. Now we're saying, well, we're producing a sentence that isn't grammatically correct and doesn't, or sorry, that is grammatically correct but doesn't have any meaning. So we have outer phenomenon, and that fits the rules of grammar, but we have no inner phenomenon because there is no comprehension associated with it. Now, people have not stopped trying to actually understand what colorless green idea sleep furiously actually refers to. This is an actual interpretation that I found online of somebody who tried to understand what colorless green idea sleep furiously actually means, and this is what they came up with. A green idea, according to well-established usage of the word green, is one that is an idea that is new and untried. Again, a colorless idea is one without vividness, dull and unexciting. So it allows that a colorless green idea is a new, untried idea that is without vividness, dull, and unexciting. To sleep is, among other things, is to be in a state of dormancy or inactivity or in a state of unconsciousness. To sleep furiously may seem a puzzling term or phrase, but one reflects that the mind in sleep often indeed moves furiously with ideas and images flickering in and out. So this is somebody actually trying to give meaning behind colorless green idea sleep furiously. Now, very interestingly, when you read this, you say, well, kind of makes sense. When they asked Noam Chomsky said, nope, didn't mean that at all. I just came up with a sentence that had absolutely no meaning and was grammatically correct. So I didn't mean that at all. So here, the inner phenomenon that somebody, the comprehension aspect that somebody tried to apply to this grammatically correct sentence is now being told you're wrong. So in other words, you have the wrong definition for what defenestrate means, because here I wasn't applying defenestrate in that particular fashion. Now, also, what Noam Chomsky indicated for us was the following, that language is not learned strictly through imitation and reinforcement. Because if you think about the way that we actually speak to children, how do we speak to children in their infancy? Think about that. We actually have what's called child-directed speech for children. Child-directed speech is higher pitched. It's produced at a lower rate of speech. So in other words, you don't say to a child, hello child, how are you? Right? You go, hi little cutie, how are you? So you say it a little bit slower and you have a higher pitch. So here, the frequency of me producing sounds is at a higher pitch. So when you think of pitch, think of a piano. On the left-hand side of the piano, it's very low-pitched sound, so doom, doom, doom. On the right-hand side of the piano, you press the keys and it's a ding, ding, ding because they're being produced at a higher frequency. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on during the semester. But that's ultimately what we're talking about. What we also find here is that children respond better to high-pitched information or high-pitched sounds than low-pitched sounds. So they prefer high-pitch versus low-pitched information. So how is it that we actually speak to children? Well, we speak to them in child-directed speech. So the, hi, little baby, how are you? Versus, hi, child, how are you today? We don't use that. So ultimately, what does Noam Chomsky believe? He believes that since we don't actually talk to children in that specific fashion, and even many times we actually babble to infants, so think about that, right? With infants, you actually don't go, hi little baby, how are you? You may even begin by blah, 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 and you actually have conversations with infants. So for instance, my child, the one who just turned 1, she still babbles quite frequently about certain things, and there are things that we still babble with her about. So we're like, blah, 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 and we try to babble with her, so that way she works on those sounds too. But it doesn't mean that she's actually learning language in that specific instance in terms of trying to understand what that word actually corresponds with. So what did Noam Chomsky believe in? Contrary to what behaviorism believed in, he had a very strong nativist or rationalist view of language acquisition, and essentially what he said was the following. Children are born with the capacity for language. So in other words, we're born with mechanisms to learn language, any language that we actually want. So what does this mean for us? It means that I should then be able to produce any language that I want from birth because I have the ability to acquire any language. I have that mechanism built into me already at birth. So if I want to learn German, I can. If I want to learn French, I can. Hey, if I want to learn Klingon, which technically is an official language that you can learn nowadays, Klingon, you can learn Klingon too if you want. So why? Because I was born with that capacity at a very early age. So when I'm born, I already have that capacity to be able to acquire any language that's ever existed, exist, or will exist in the future. I have that ability at a very young age. But what happens when I start getting a little bit older? I start losing sensitivity to be able to actually acquire that information, thus making it more difficult for me to acquire new languages in the future. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of language development later on. So, what do we actually find here? We find that there are major changes in terms of this aspect of history. So, there are some major language changes that we go through. So when you actually look at languages and how they actually change, many languages actually have common ancestry. And this will be kind of the last thing that I'm going to talk about for our lecture for today in reference to this aspect of historical roots associated with language. So when we think about this aspect of language changes, many languages have very specific ancestries or very common ancestries. So, for instance, we do have Proto-Indo-European languages like Finnish, for instance. That's a Proto-Indo-European language that has common roots from different languages or common ancestries. Spanish, for instance, is part of the Romance languages. We trace our lineage back to Latin roots and also Greek roots in terms of our language. English, which we actually call a very dirty language, and we call it a dirty language because it's very it's a dirty language because it's a mixture of so many different ancestries, and that's why we actually call it a dirty language. It's not very pure like Spanish or French or German that has very few ancestries or very few roots from other languages. So English is quite a dirty language in terms of that aspect, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the semester as well. But here, we also see that languages change over time. So, for instance, if you actually look at the Icelandic language that they speak in Iceland, since it's so secluded and doesn't have so many influences like English or Spanish does, it's changed very little in the last 1,000 years. But if you look at English 1,000 years ago versus the common English that we use now or our current English, it's a huge, huge difference between the two. And why? Well, because our English is so vastly influenced by other languages, let that be Romance languages, Latin languages, etc., 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 that we have all these different influences, thus changing it dramatically. For next week, for our lecture, I'm going to show you all the Lord's Prayer in Old English versus the Lord's Prayer in current day English, so that way you guys can see the differences between those two. We also see that there's lots of dialectical differences that we actually encounter. So there are different languages at different points in times in specific places. So for instance, in South Africa, they went from speaking Dutch because they were colonized by Dutch settlers from the Netherlands. So in South Africa, they spoke Dutch for many, many years. That then became what's now called Afrikaans. Afrikaans is a new language system that is a mixture of Dutch and traditional or native African dialects that were spoken by the native individuals of South Africa. So it's actually a mixture of languages to create a new language. Latin, for instance, then stemmed to becoming French, becoming Italian, becoming Spanish. So it actually evolved to something different. And that's very, very important for us. Now, there's very interesting aspect that we sometimes find in terms of languages. So there's this differentiation if you want to think about language. Languages before they become languages is something else. So we first start by what's called being a Pidgin language. Then we have what's called a Creole language, and then we have a formal language, right? So we have Pidgin, Creole, and then formal language. So what are the differences between the three? Well, a Pidgin language is essentially a new language system that is being created by a group of individuals that is being spoken by them, but it doesn't occur in a lot of individuals. It's only used by a subset of individuals. So think of it like the first generation. The Creole language now is when more of the children of that first Pidgin language, right? So their generation, so now the children of those individuals are now also beginning to use that language. Now, as more and more and more individuals start using that language and it starts becoming more formalized and being much more accepted into society, it then can move from being a Creole to being an official language. And all languages actually go through this process, that they begin as Pidgin, so being spoken by some individuals. Then their children adopt that language, so then it becomes a Creole, right? Because more individuals are now using it. And now, since more and more and more individuals are using it, it now then becomes a formalized language and much more largely accepted. So, for instance, Afrikaans was a Creole language for a very long time. It was Pidgin, then Creole, and now it's actually being an accepted form of communications in South Africa by a group of individuals. So that is our summary for today in terms of our lecture, in terms of the history of psycholinguistics and the history of psychology of language. And we're going to talk much more about our linguistic principles, which is going to be the next lecture that we're going to discuss for next week. So the properties of language, or the aspects associated with linguistic production next week. If you guys have any questions, feel free to send me an email, chat with me on Blackboard IM that you guys can access through Blackboard, or feel free to call me if you do have any questions. Have a good rest of your day, and again, as a reminder, do complete your language journal by Friday by 11:59 p.m.